Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk to us about a process that is happening within our societies and our laws. Something that is around us every day and impacting us in ways that we've maybe never even thought about. This is the Iron Law of Prohibition. Yeah, it's a complex idea, but over the next 6 minutes, I'm going to aim to break it down so we can understand this process and the effect that it has at work around us. So, the Iron Law of Prohibition is an academic term, first described in the mid-1980s, and the essence of which posits, as law enforcement becomes more intense, the potency of prohibited substances increases. So Richard Cowan is the man who first used this term, and he described it as the harder the enforcement, the harder the drugs. I realize that that's a bit of a mouthful and a definition that's going to require me to lay a bit of a foundation first. So let's break it down by going back in time and starting with a real-life example. Alcohol prohibition. Likely something most of us have heard about. And believe it or not, from 1920 to 1933, the U.S. government imposed a nationwide ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of all alcoholic beverages. Prior to Prohibition, most Americans that drank alcohol drank pretty low alcohol beer. This was the drink of choice. Alcohol was sold legally. There was really no incentive or need for a black market. Most of us have heard of the infamous bootlegger, Al Capone, and without diving into a real deep history lesson, the takeaway that I want you to have is that one of the unintended consequences of alcohol prohibition was incentivizing the creation of market players like Al Capone. The motivation is simple. Outside observers concluded that some people had developed serious problems with alcohol, which resulted in harm, of course, to both themselves and to society at large. It was called the Noble Experiment, undertaken to reduce crime and corruption, to solve social problems, to reduce the tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and improve health and hygiene in America. The vast majority of people consumed alcohol responsibly, but it was the egregious behavior and consequences of a minority that motivated teetotalers and prohibitionists to advocate for this total ban. You know, when we observe problems in Western societies, us humans tend to have a naive, knee-jerk reaction of believing we can make the problem go away if we make the cause of the problem illegal. I don't know, perhaps we are susceptible to this strange and slightly ignorant belief that when a government makes something illegal, people will automatically stop doing it. Psychologists would probably call this a cognitive distortion of magical thinking. Unsurprisingly, the change in status of alcohol from legal to illegal actually had very little impact on demand. The author Leo Beletsky from the International Journal of Drug Policy writes in his paper, Today's Fentanyl Crisis, Prohibition's Iron Law Revisited, that national alcohol prohibition highlights the unintended but predictable impact of supply-side interventions on the dynamics of illicit drug markets. Under the Iron Law of Prohibition, efforts to interrupt and suppress the illicit drug supply produce economic and logistical pressures favoring ever more compact substitutes. The fact that people continue to desire and seek out alcohol despite its new status as an illegal drug is only the first part of the Iron Law at work. There's a more sinister and destructive force that makes this process so interesting and continues to impact our lives today. So remember how I said prior to Prohibition most Americans drank low alcohol beer? Let's picture the esteemed businessman Al Capone contemplating how, in a risky illegal business, he was going to maximize his profits. Under the cover of darkness, he may have loaded up a wagon with barrels of beer and snuck it into a local town. On that wagon, he may have had enough beer for 100 people. But Al wants to make as much money as quickly as possible. He knows law enforcement is gunning for him, and it's unlikely he'll be able to hand this business down through the generations. So, Al starts thinking about ways to maximize profits. And what does he realize? That same wagon can bring enough beer, that brings enough beer for 100 people, can bring in enough moonshine and bathtub gin for 1,000. This is the very essence of the Iron Law of Prohibition, also referred to by libertarian Judge Jim Gray as the cardinal rule of prohibition, who notes it's actually a powerful argument for the legalization of drugs. The thesis taken here from Wikipedia is that when drugs or alcohol are prohibited, they are produced in black markets in more concentrated and powerful forms. Because these more potent forms offer better efficiency in the business model, they take up less space in storage, less weight in transportation, they sell for more money. You know, a modern day example of this can be witnessed at football stadiums throughout America. In the parking lots before games, tailgate parties are a common sight. Groups gather to eat and drink before the game, and a walk through the parking lot will reveal that the drink of choice for most is beer. When the game begins and fans enter the stadium where outside alcohol is prohibited, the product that is smuggled in flasks and Mickeys is hard liquor. The preference for most may actually be a less potent form of the drug. But when it comes to smuggling, size matters. An interesting phenomenon with these substances is that higher potency forms tend to be smaller, therefore easier to smuggle, but far less safe for consumers. There is a parallel to this process happening today in our province and throughout North America, and it is a driving force in the ongoing overdose crisis. Fentanyl is a far more potent and easier to produce synthetic opioid than heroin, and it's replaced heroin in the illegal market. As a reaction to the overprescription of opioids in America during the early 2000s, and the transition of cut-off individuals from legal opioids to heroin, overdose deaths involving heroin in the U.S. spiked rapidly, tripling between 2010 and 2015. Law enforcement actually intensified their interdiction and enforcement efforts, and as a result, the cost of illegality increased. Thus, there's a greater need to avoid detection, and it results in necessitating an increase in the potency of the substances. Producers and smugglers realized that fentanyl was a solution to avoiding law enforcement and increasing profit margins. We've mostly been indoctrinated by a narrative in our culture that drugs are bad. And from our response has actually been the war on drugs and an attempt to eliminate them from our societies. The consequence has actually been an increase in addiction and overdose deaths. I am reminded of the quote from Virgil, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." Looking around us today at the last 90 or so years of legal alcohol sales in our societies, we have regulated and eliminated the black market. There are no secret alcohol dealers. There is no underground war raging for domination in the alcohol market. The head of Coors isn't putting out a hit on the head of Budweiser. There is no job for Al Capone anymore. So now that we understand the process by which the Iron Law of Prohibition impacts the illegal market for substances, and we've witnessed the order that can be established in the light of a legal and regulatory framework, I want to conclude with a story and a controversial but logical destination for our future society. There were some teens on a street corner in USA. They wanted to drink, but regulation keeps alcohol behind counters and requires ID and a certain age. Some of us may recall from our younger years, in order to drink, we would have needed an adult accomplice to supply us with the alcohol. Well, these particular teens couldn't find anyone to get them booze that day, but they had no trouble accessing the illegal market and purchasing marijuana. It wasn't actually what they wanted to do, but it was what they settled on. No ID required, no regulatory tape to get through, a dealer on every corner. Keeping the drug illegal incentivizes dealers and makes drugs we would like to keep away from our young people even more accessible to them. We can't even keep drugs out of our prisons, what makes us believe we can keep them out of our borders? So this brings me to a vision for the future, one in which addiction decreases and overdose deaths are all but eliminated. How do we get there? The process would essentially be reverse prohibition, to do what we did with alcohol with other drugs as well. Mark Thornton observes in his policy piece, alcohol prohibition was a failure, that prohibition itself is actually an argument for legalization. Thanks for listening. I'm glad that you can now understand the process of the Iron Law of Prohibition at work in our societies, in our lives, impacting you today. I hope you give it a little more thought.